Hi, good morning, everybody. Delighted to welcome you back for the second day of Joycean Cartographies. Welcome to those of you who are in the room and to those of you who are out there in the Zoomiverse. My name is Steve Hindle. I'm Director of Research here, and I'm your host for this program. There are several people who are in the room today who weren't here yesterday. If that's the case, my commiserations. You missed some really excellent talks and some wonderful discussion, but we're delighted to have you here. I'll just reiterate very briefly the housekeeping announcements before I introduce President Karen Lawrence. So please, no food or drink in the room. If you've ordered lunch, lunch is served outside in the Rose Hills Garden Court. If you're going to walk around the gardens, please make sure you have your conference badge on. And restrooms are on the northern side of the lobby here in Rothenberg Hall. So we're delighted to have you all here. As those of you who were here yesterday are aware, the conference is punctuated by a series of readings and commentaries from Ulysses. And we're going to start today's program with the fourth in that series, which is Lotus Eaters.
In Westland Row, he halted before the window of the Belfast and Oriental Tea Company and read the legends of lead-papered packets. Choice blend, finest quality, family tea. Rather warm tea. Must get some from Tom Kernan. Couldn't ask him at a funeral, though. While his eyes still read blandly, he took off his hat, quietly inhaling his hair oil, and sent his right hand with slow grace over his brow and hair. Very warm morning. Under their dropped lids, his eyes found the tiny bow of the leather headband inside his high-grade hat. Just there. His right hand came down into the bowl of his hat. His fingers found quickly a card behind the headband and transferred it to his waistcoat pocket. So, first of all, what's happening here? It's 10 in the morning, and Bloom is looking in the window in the Belfast Oriental Tea Company. He takes his hat off of his head and searches around for Martha Clifford's card inside his hat. But what is it about this moment that prompts Bloom to search for the card? A card that signifies an alter ego as well as a distraction from Bloom's domestic life. One clue might be found in the subtle tea advertisements that he reads. Choice blend, finest quality, family tea. Might the mention of family tea subconsciously provoke Bloom to search for the card in his hat? Since this passage is one from the Lotus Eaters episode, one must recall the Homeric Parallels in the text. In Homer's Odyssey, Odysseus and his men happen upon the Lotus Eaters on their journey home from Ithaca. The Lotus Eaters, suspended in a drugged and warm stupor, are dangerous because of the numbed oblivion of the narcotic lotus that they offer, tempting men to lose motivation and forget their greater goals of returning to their families in Ithaca. This brief moment in Ulysses might be read as the temptation of distraction offered by Martha Clifford to the fictitious Henry Flower. As Bloom's disembodied eyes read the tea labels, his hand moves independently to retrieve the card, as if he is no longer in control of his body's movements, and the parts move alone, as if drugged by some other force. In addition to the Homeric influence in this text, the passage is also marked by its humor. For a passage dominated by tea, the kind that one drinks, it's notable that the letter T is missing from Bloom's high-grade ha. Contextual and orthographical humor aside, this little phrase is a little bit of an inside joke unique to Bloom and the readers that come to know him. Readers first encounter Bloom's high-grade ha in Calypso. It's a very small detail, and it's really easy to miss or mistake it for a typo, but it's powerful for its ability to envelop the reader into Bloom's unique mannerisms. Joyce's work here is multivalent. It encompasses both the highbrow humor of his writing style while subtly weaving in a more profound question of family and duty, all briefly examined in the moment it takes Bloom to read tea labels.
Thank you, everybody. So the first panel of the day is entitled Concentric Circles. As was the case yesterday, we have two moderators. Kevin Detmar is going to take care of the Q&A submitted virtually through the Zoom portal. So if you're out there in the Zoomiverse, please do submit your questions as you hear the papers and indeed afterwards. But more importantly, here in the room, the session will be moderated and introduced by President Karen Lawrence. Karen, welcome.
Good morning. Great to see everyone and to have everyone join us virtually. I'm going to introduce the three speakers all at once, and then they will come up to the podium. We want to have maximum time for their papers and for discussion. So the first speaker is Marilyn Risebaum. She's the Harrison King McCann Professor of English at Bowdoin College. Her scholarship is in the areas of modernism, contemporary Scottish and Irish literatures and film, and Jewish cultural studies. She's the author of James Joyce's Judaic Other from Stanford, and numerous essays on Joyce, and is co-editor with Kimberly Devlin of Ulysses Engendered Perspectives, 18 new essays on the episodes from South Carolina. She co-authored with Maud Ellman and Guard, Two Gallants in Collaborative Dubliners, and her recent book, Unfit, Jewish Degeneration and Modernism, published by Bloomsbury Academic, considers the impact of degeneration theory on developments in modernism. She's currently writing a monograph on Muriel Sparks' style called Muriel Sparks' Art of Ridicule. Our second speaker will be Nico Israel, who's a professor of English at the City University of New York's Graduate Center and Hunter College. He's the author of two books, Spirals, The World Image in 20th Century Literature and Art from Columbia, and Outlandish, Writing Between Exile and Diaspora from Stanford. He's published numerous articles on literature, literary theory, and continental philosophy, and over 70 essays on contemporary visual art. Wow. Recent publications include an essay on the collection of visual art in the UN New York headquarters, on Samuel Beckett's theater and fiction and Giorgio Agamben's conception of the gag, on the constructed international language Esperanto, James Joyce's Ulysses and Finnegan's Wake, and the relation between language as such and gesture. He's currently working on a book reconsidering modernist universalisms. Finally, Malcolm Sen teaches at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst. His research interests include the environmental humanities and post-colonial studies. He's especially interested in the changing aspects of political sovereignty at a time of climate crisis. He's the author of a forthcoming monograph from Syracuse University Press called Unnatural Disasters, Literature, Climate Change, Sovereignty, and editor of the Cambridge History of Irish Literature and the Environment, which will be published in 2022. He is co-editing Race in Irish Literature and Culture, also to be published in 2022. Two recent essays include An Ordinary Crisis, SARS-CoV-2, and Irish Studies, and Sovereignty at the Margins, the Oceanic Future of the Subaltern. It is my pleasure to welcome Marilyn Risebaum to the podium.
Thank you so much. Excuse me, Karen, and I'm going to add my voice to the chorus of thank yous to the Huntington, to the organizing committee, to Alice Tsai in particular, and also Karen Lawrence. And I just wanted to say I'm so much enjoying listening to everybody's talks, and especially after hearing the panel on counter maps yesterday, I'm mindful that the area of my own focus is quite local. And I expect that I will also see that contrast with my panelists today. As it happens, even before this conference was announced, I had recently been thinking quite a lot about Joyce's story, Two Gallants and Dubliners, and in particular the movements of one of the duo or boyos of that story, Lenehan. In the story, they, Corley and Lenehan's plan to extort money from a housemaid is obscured by their sexual innuendos, fooling the reader as perhaps the maid of their intentions. I was writing about Evelyn Conlon's creative response to the story in her own story, Two Gallants Getting Caught, written for the Dubliners 100 volume, produced in 2014 in honor of the centenary of Dubliners, and so a shadow event to this one. Dubliners 100 features contemporary Irish writers, each with their own original story keyed to one of the stories in Dubliners. Evelyn Conlon's story maps Lenehan's movements to mark the difference between the times, 1905, when the story was first completed, and 2014. Evelyn's approach to this is interpolative, woven throughout her story about theft, which in the case of her modern characters comes in the form of plagiarism of one of the Joyce scholars by another. There are narrative interventions that echo Joyce's original. These serve to rewrite Joyce's story in a kind of future anterior, reading back from the future to illuminate Joyce's narrative in physical landscapes and to establish a resonance between them. As one of the plagiarists puts it, between stealing from a girl, whether it be the woman scholar in her story or the slavey in Joyce's, and colonial plunder inscribed on the landscape. One of Conlon's feature interpolations, for instance, echoes Lenehan's movements along the railings of Duke's Lawn, a space between the National Library and Museum that fronted what was originally Kildare House, built by the ascendancy aristocrat James Fitzgerald, who later assumed the title Duke of Leinster, assuming, too, the Irish place names, in anglicized form, of course. The mansion then became Leinster House. He built it in what was, in the mid-18th century, the unfashionable south side of Dublin. In 1815, the third Earl of Leinster sold the house to the Royal Dublin Society. But not until 1922 would Leinster House officially become the Parliament building after the establishment of the Free State, fitting in part because of James's son, Edward Fitzgerald, who played an instrumental role in the Irish Rebellion of 1798. The Irish Free State also took on the production of maps of the country, wresting it from the British Board, who produced the Ordnance Survey that we've been hearing about. Evelyn's interpolation points to what's missing, not in the sense of what's no longer there, but what will be etched in that might make a difference in the life of a character like Lenehan, whose public face as chancer for much of the story covers up a ravaged and forsaken figure we see in his private moments. The railing is a synecdoche. Lenehan is waiting for his fortunes to change. As this passage from Joyce's story continues, Lenehan's fingers move along the railings as though it were the strings of a harp, in yet another moment of resonance with the same old story of exploitation of the nation, insofar as the harp is the national symbol, here standing in for the slavey who is being extorted. But through Conlon's vision of it, the railings as reference to a future national monument withstand the ravages of a past history. Lenehan's motives and actions may be questionable, but he might also be channeling Joyce's intention to expose the ravages of Dublin's cartographic history. It is not only Conlon's intervention that brings this cartographic apprehension, though she calls it out. The house itself does not make it on the map of the story and often does not appear on the maps of the era, while Duke's Lawn or Leinster Lawn does. Still, the mention of Duke's Lawn twice in the story signals this history. In Ithaca, by the way, Bloom remembers Millie playing on the pleasance, that is the lawn, in view of an English visitor. As John Hegland so aptly illustrates in his essay about Joyce's use of the 19th century British Ordnance Survey in Ulysses, Maps can function as catalysts for transforming the spatial orientation of the individual subject, using geographical knowledge as a staging ground for the possible rather than as an archival record of the actual. Haeglin's epigraph from Deleuze and Guattari reinforced this idea. Writing and mapping share the power to imagine realms to come. Eric Bolson adds, as we heard yesterday, that Joyce uses the imperial map as a form of resistance to its colonial imposition on Dublin, an act of reappropriation, a way of imagining Ireland as an independent nation in the not-so-distant future with a colonial past. The maps I use here, except where they are modern, while not drawn directly on the survey, are commensurate with what is presented there. So what's Lenehan got to do with it? With Ulysses, that is. There are several characters who migrate from Dubliners' stories to Ulysses, but Lenehan is one who appears often, who walks into the newspaper office in the 7th chapter of Ulysses with a little of the ready to place a bet on the horse Scepter, and Duffy suggests emphatically that he got that off of his pal, Corley, from his extortion of the money from the girl in Two Gallants. At least Lenehan is there in Aeolus to place the bets as bookie, in his characteristic presentation as sponger, looking for angles and handouts. I wondered what difference it makes when we map Dubliners onto Ulysses. While we might think of Stephen Dedalus and Leopold Bloom as co-protagonists destined to meet and crossing each other's paths throughout the day of June 16th, Lenehan might also fill the bill, shadowing Bloom throughout the novel, even making an appearance in Bloom's ruminations/fantasies about Molly's lovers at the end of his day. Alex Wallach contends that co-protagonists call attention to the distribution of attention within the broader development of stratified character fields, and that such dual protagonists are often dueling, jockeying for position. Certainly Stephen and Bloom have been, at least in the minds of the readers, and arguably in Ithaca, where they face off. You might say there is an inverse relation between the amount of narrative space Lenehan occupies in Ulysses and the amount of attention he has received as a minor character. In part, and what you see here is where they both appear in the novel and then where they overlap. In part, this would register in the corollary of mapping what I suppose could be called a more minor work onto a major work, Dubliners onto Ulysses, but then how should we factor in the transition of a major character, at least in terms of Lenehan's focalization in Two Gallants, into minor status in Ulysses? One way is to think of both Lenehan and Bloom as minor characters in the Deleuzian sense, as outsider-insiders, both no men. And I suppose it's not the only character you could say this about, minor character, but I think that Lenehan does some major work in a minor way. There is a homologous relationship between hunger and the mnemonic, particularized in the minor figure of Lenehan. As far as I can tell, we're missing his first name. While occupying space, moving about the city, he also seems circumscribed by it. He is driven by hunger of various kinds, but particularly drink. While the reader can appreciate his loser status without reading Two Gallants, for instance, he's trailed by his loss on the horse Scepter. Unless they have already encountered him in Dubliners, they will not see the pathos in his character. As in Evelyn's story, he is a pointer to a potential he cannot realize, incessantly anticipatory, expecting every moment to be his next, which is in Lenehan's reflexive phrase in the Cyclops chapter, referring to Bloom's anticipation of Rudy's birth. That's his reflexive phrase. As Otto Quayson observed yesterday, Bloom too is activated by anticipation. But for Lenehan, that's the condition of playing the odds. In cartographic or spatial terms, measured by his movements into and through Ulysses, Lenehan is a winner. He covers a lot of ground, but where to? His movements, when mapped, take a shape. That map itself is not a ready explanation, but as Franco Moretti suggests, at least it shows us there's something to be explained. In Jasmine Mulligan's virtual project, Mapping Dubliners, She maps Lenehan's path in two gallants, observing its mnemonic shape. She writes, if the visual cue on its own isn't entirely convincing, we can consider Lenehan's thoughts just before he walks the mnemonic lines of his route. In a shop, eating his peas, he considers all the missing pieces of his life, a job, a home, a warm fire, a good dinner. The empty space in his mnemonic route comes only a few minutes after he's recognized the empty space in his life, a sort of perambulatory confirmation of his preceding thoughts. And this is a long quote, and I won't read it, but if you look at the highlighted sections, especially he knew that he would have to speak a great deal, the problem of how he could pass the hours till he met, and so on, you can get a sense of what I've just been describing. And I would also have a look at the last highlighted one, just to keep that in mind. In this passage, we observe Lenehan in a private moment, perceive the pathos along with his need to keep walking, and the meagerness of his repast. Nothing but biscuits. Margot Norris has referred to him as an involuntary flaneur. Like Luke Gibbons argues that he is an outcast. One way in which diasporic space is marked in the novel is through the lack of home, to be exiled in place. When you see the map, you realize that Lenehan has walked miles, almost 5, on pretty much an empty stomach. When you put up the map of his movements in Ulysses, you see that his path is roughly the same, circumscribed in the north part of the city. A note about the dotted lines here, they indicate our uncertainty about how Lenehan gets around between places in Ulysses, but maybe Dubliners helps. In two gallants, he begins in Rutland Square, and as we saw, circles back to it before returning at the end to meet his accomplice on the south side of the city, not far from Leinster House. I suppose Rutland Square is groan-worthingly apt in terms of the circles he walks, perhaps worthy of the kind of not-so-clever punning Lenehan is prone to. It's also worth noting the shift by this time between the north and the south sides of the city, which traded places as the fashionable and affluent parts. Rutland Square, named after yet another ascendancy duke, at first an area for promenade of the gentility, became a meeting point for home rule activists. And in 1933, it was renamed Parnell Square. Joyce could not foresee that, but he marks the area in its current condition in a number of ways. Lenehan begins his sojourn in Ulysses quite close to Rutland Square on Princess Street and Middle Abbey Street, where the Freeman's Journal and Evening Telegraph was behind the General Post Office on Sackville, now O'Connell Street, which of course would be destroyed during the uprising and by the time Ulysses was published. And as we heard yesterday, naming the streets around the GPO works to map loss in its own kind of way. The newspaper began to lose readership, and its decline is evident in many ways in Joyce's chapter, including the seemingly hurricane-force drafts in the office that suggest a crumbling edifice. During the 1922 Civil War, its machinery was destroyed, and by 1923, the paper was no more. As has been observed, Joyce's depiction does not fit with the actual historical moment of 1904, when the paper was healthier, the politics affecting it different. By 1907, as one critic puts it, you can smell putrefaction. The chapter anticipates the paper's demise having to do with the decline of Parnellism. The editor, Miles Crawford, refers to the paper as the old woman of Princess Street, conflating the degraded news source with yet another Irish national emblem, the old woman of Ireland, also degraded like the harp. The newspaper office is a marker of the neighborhood in which it resides, whose declining fortunes are mirrored in the political shifts. Lenehan enters the chapter with a Spoonerism, feet stoops instead of footsteps, referring to the barefoot newsboys coming into the hall. It is one of his abler linguistic plays in an effort to invent and amuse, which we have learned from Dubliners is his stratagem for survival. The Spoonerism, reflective of the children's unshod condition and of the failing newspaper is at once self-reflexive for Lenehan again. In the background, someone is playing The Boys of Wexford on the mouth organ, circling us back to the 1798 rebellion and to another losing battle. Lenehan's first interaction with Bloom is in the newspaper office. He shadows Bloom in ways that were surprising to me. Bloom is seen as a flaneur, of course, but his flaneurism is also involuntary. He anxiously walks the city to avoid home, and he also is seen as an outcast. As ad canvasser, he's a kind of beggar who needs to persuade. One might say they are both all-around cultured men, to use Lenehan's own epithet for Bloom in Wandering Rocks, with a touch of the artist about him, more suitable perhaps for Lenehan as poseur. With his pretentious display of knowledge, he wields French, Latin, and his incessant witticisms. Still, he is educated. The differences are more profound. Though they meet in pubs, they are mostly off after different kinds of sustenance. Bloom is looking to help others, gathering funds for widows. Lenehan is jockeying for drinks and is expert at the toast. And Bloom has a home, however vexed a space it might be. If Bloom has hunger, it is metaphysical, for belonging, for Molly. I had not noticed before mapping their proximity to one another more of a literary mapping, that in almost every case, Lenehan mocks and or disparages Bloom to his face. He taunts him about his losses. And out of Bloom's earshot, he makes some salacious comment about Molly, rife with sexual innuendo. In Aeolus, in their first encounter in the novel, under the heading of A Collision Ensues, Lenehan pretends to hurt Bloom, knees him. Bloom characteristically apologizes. I want to consider another such occasion having to do with physical hunger. This is a quote from Two Gallants again. If you read about here having this sort of, he was hungry except for some biscuits. And here's a quote from Cyclops, and I'll leave it up, so while I'm talking you can see it. In Two Gallants, Lenehan repeats the phrase, "that takes the biscuit," pretentiously the recherché biscuit, as a rejoinder to Corley's accounts of seduction. Lenehan repeats the phrase in Cyclops, in Barney Kernan's pub on Green Street, and his circuitous itinerary, this time to mark the loss of a bet on the horse race and the charge that Bloom had the tip all along and was now cashing in. The biscuit has tropological properties, but appears mostly as its material self, being eaten, found in pockets, sought after. Claire Colleton makes an argument about the narrative force of the phrase, that taking the biscuit was meant to take a rhetorical lead. Greg Winston has written compellingly about the role of the biscuit tin and W&R Jacob Biscuit Factory during the Easter Rising. W&R Jacob Biscuit Factory, founded in 1853, finally sold in 2004 and was located on Bishop Street, taking us back around to the then unfashionable side of Dublin. It was by all accounts only the second major factory in Dublin after Guinness. That so many in Ulysses are looking for finding and eating broken biscuits is indicative of the hunger that was rampant in a city whose major food manufacturer was as insubstantial as crackers. Taking the biscuit is the expression that precedes taking the cake, which as far as I can tell has some scurrilous origins, but in any case, it is an undesirable prize. Drawing on Joyce's arguments in the Piccolo articles, Eric Bolson observes that the empire maintained its power by making it impossible for the Irish to develop economic interests at home and abroad. The state of manufacturing in Dublin in this period, let's say, took the biscuit. The specter of the famine is certainly on the map of Joyce's novel in ways that those who touted Dublin as the second city of the empire would not see or put on the map, from the Cyclops quotation I had on. Old Mother Hubbard went to the cupboard. Not there, my child. I'm just concluding. In both Dubliners and Ulysses, we see that Lenehan, we last see Lenehan in the vicinity of the Hollis Street Maternity Hospital. No stillbirth or rebirth cracks here. But looking back at the maps of his movements, we notice that in both cases, he is taken out of his orbit. Duke's Lawn is down the street. Hume Street, where Lenehan observed the slavey working in an affluent establishment, is closer. He's headed to the south side. At least that's in his plan. Thank you very much.
Well, let me just begin by joining others in thanking the organizers. It's so great to be here with all of you. Are we ready to go with the video? I'll just do a little, oh, there we go. I was going to do a little song and dance saying that the first time I was here was when I was on a third grade field trip. I grew up in Southern California, and that was back during the Ford administration, but I do have a lot of fond memories of the Huntington over the years. So let's get this started. I wanted to begin by showing you a brief video charting the rise and fall of the Ottoman Empire set against the geographical borders of 21st century European nation states. As you can see from this truly bad map, the Osmanli İmparatorluğu extended from its origins in the northwest of modern-day Turkey around the turn of the 15th century to parts of the modern-day Balkans and Greece, northward and westward into Romania, Bulgaria, and Hungary, eastward to Ukraine, and southward to Egypt and part of the Arabian Peninsula. By the later 16th century, Lebanon, Syria, and parts of Iraq were part of the empire, and by the later 17th, Armenia, Azerbaijan, and parts of Georgia were conquered. Shortly afterward, the Ottomans took the coastal strip of North Africa, stretching from Morocco, Algeria, and Libya to Eritrea and Djibouti, giving them virtually complete control over the Aegean and the Red Sea, a strong presence throughout the Mediterranean, and access to the Adriatic and Black Seas and the Persian Gulf. The green areas encompass what was actually an array of governmental structures, from the empire proper to vassal states. Very generally speaking, in the mode of sovereignty exercised in the empire, local governments paid tributes to the Ottomans and then were left alone, except that is, if they rebelled. Within these zones, many different ethnic groups lived side by side in relative autonomy. That is to say that in, for example, Western Turkey and the nearby Greek islands, the area where my grandparents were born, lived Turks, Greeks, Armenians, Bulgarians, Sephardic Jews, and Syrian Christians, each with their own places of worship and languages, but often doing business with one another and speaking some Turkish and sometimes French as a lingua franca. In Alexandria were found many of the same ethnicities, along with Arab and North African Muslims. In Macedonia and Bosnia, the same ethnicities plus Slavs and Albanians. Among the lands depicted by these green zones, at one time under Ottoman control, are many of the most important geographical locations in Ulysses, or in the Odyssey. Ancient Greece, and the wandering areas of Odysseus, with the important exception of Sicily, mythical home of the Cyclops, Hungary, from where the Viraj family emigrated to Ireland, including the city of Szombathely, which was occupied by Ottomans and then by the Habsburgs, North Africa, which Bloom sometimes confuses with Turkey, with its foods, fragrances, and sensuality, and Araby, which sounds exotic but proves in the Joyce story of that name to be an utterly banal traveling fair featuring bored employees with working-class English accents that passes through Dublin and crushes a young man's naive dreams of an elsewhere. Can you please resume the video now? The second half of this video provides a visual record of the slow decline of the Ottoman Empire in the 2 centuries after it reached the apex of its importance. What it doesn't show is how the empire was effectively picked apart by other European imperial formations, especially Britain and France, but also Austria-Hungary and Russia. It is crucial to recognize how often the once grand, now shrinking empire, and to a lesser extent the emerging smaller nation state of Turkey, would have been in the news around the time, in the international news around the time of the writing and publication of Ulysses, not only because the Ottomans were one of the Axis powers who lost the Great War, Between 1914 and 1923, hundreds of thousands of Armenians were massacred and deported. Palestine was occupied under British mandate, and mass population transfers between Greece and Turkey occurred, displacing millions. Smyrna is not only the city from where Eliot's The Wastelands merchant with a pocket full of currants comes, it's the city where, in 1922, a huge fire was blamed on sectarian violence. Oh, you're starting it again? Okay. I should have stopped it, but it's okay. Just keep it going. You can see, let's retell the story of the rise and fall of the Ottoman Empire. Anyway, so it's important to realize how geographically close Joyce was to former Ottoman-controlled territories when he lived in Trieste as he began writing the text. And this and the proximity of Trieste to Venice accounts for some of the architectural motifs that Rishana showed us so brilliantly yesterday. Lest my talk so far seem like a rudimentary history and geography lesson, let me clarify my aim here. Reorienting Ulysses toward the once great imperial force to the southeast doesn't so much displace the now familiar narrative of the predominantly military and ideological forces for the young Joyce, the British Empire and the Roman Catholic Church, as productively complicate that narrative. Obviously, the manifold implications of British and Roman Catholic domination of Ireland remain among Ulysses' central foci, exerting as they do not only control of space and movement, but of language and, through language, individual consciousnesses. Still, a peripheral view of the Ottoman Empire gives a fuller sense of the differently vectored relations of power that undergird modern imperialism and colonialism. Moreover, to discuss the Ottoman Empire's and/or Turkey's appearances in Ulysses gives more definition to the text portrayal of the East in general, which, as we have seen over the past couple of days, is pretty capacious. And it is also crucial to recognize how the collapse of the Ottoman Empire in some way anticipates the eventual shrinking of the once globe-stretching British Empire into its present status as a comparatively tiny, willfully insular nation-state. I'm leaving aside much of the theoretical part of my argument for the sake of staying within my allotted time. But let me gesture very briefly to two names. First, to Palmira Brummett, whose book Mapping the Ottomans, which might just as well be called Unmapping the Ottomans, explores the ways in which the empire and its peoples and customs were literally and figuratively mapped by and in relation to neighboring empires, especially in the early modern period. And second, to Edward Said, not so much to Orientalism, but to his less explicitly early Foucauldian culture and imperialism, where Said notes the rise in the early 20th century of a new encyclopedic form of the novel that draws attention to itself as substituting art and its creations for the once possible synthesis of the world empires. Though Said's claim somewhat misrecognizes the complex interrelation between irony, sincerity, longing, and critique in Joyce's globalizing comic novel. Suffice to say, the text forays into exoticism, the exoticism of the so-called Orient, are rarely left unproblematized and are often rerouted back into the framework of British imperialism, as in the case of Araby, as I discussed briefly in passing. In Proteus, in the text's early pages, Stephen Dedalus, watching the dogs on the beach, still feels the effects of his dream of the night before, in which a man offers him a melon. After Haynes woke me last night, same dream or was it? Wait. Open hallway, street of harlots, remember, Harun al-Rashid. I am almosting it. That man led me, spoke, I was not afraid. The melon he had held against my face, smiled, cream fruit smell. That was the rule, said, in, come, red carpet spread, you will see who. This stock image of the unctuously friendly salesman in a Turkish or Arab bazaar, clearly anticipating Stephen's meeting later in the day with Bloom, is complicated by Stephen's association of the scene with Harun al-Rashid, the famous pre-Ottoman caliph who ushered in the Islamic Golden Age, but who is also associated with the story-hunting figure in 1001 Nights, itself in part a tale addressing fear of marital infidelity. This is reflected in Stephen's linkage of the bazaar with a street of harlots, anticipating the scene in Circe in which Bloom, who briefly appears as Haroun, rescues Stephen in Nighttown after he has been abandoned by his friends. Finally, however, Stephen's recollection of his dream merges into the nightmare that terrified Oxford student Haynes, whose father, we have already learned, made his fortune, quote, selling jalap to Zulus, end quote, presumably in South Africa, where Britain had a quasi-colonial presence. Well in advance of the comic book and subsequent Black American political party, Black Panther was the sobriquet taken by the German-employed spy Frederick Joubert Duquesne, who terrorized the British from 1899 to 1902 during the Second Boer War, a great inspiration to many independence-seeking Irish, as shown throughout Ulysses. In this way, the stock exoticism of the image of the man with the cream fruit melon is overdetermined by the multiple geographies, histories, and economies of the two intermingled dreams. Not only is Bloom anticipatorily introduced with a veneer of dreamlike exoticism undergirded by global imperial machinations, the set of associations continue once we begin following him on his day. From the moment in Calypso he thinks of his bath, hammam, Turkish massage, until his sleepy recording in Ithaca of his expenditures when he recalls his movement toward the oriental edifice of the Turkish and warm baths, 11 Leinster Street, an actual building in early 20th century Dublin. Bloom has Ottoman images and lands on and in his mind. In Calypso, in Dlugac's pork butcher shop, while waiting to be served, Bloom takes a page from the pile of cut sheets and, as we heard in Otto Quayson's talk, for the rest of the day, continues to think of and respond to the proto-Zionist ad for the Agendath Netayim Planters Company. To purchase waste sandy tracts from Turkish government and plant with eucalyptus trees. Excellent for shade, fuel, and construction. Orange groves and immense melon fields north of Jaffa. You pay 80 marks, and they plant a dunam of land for you, with olives, oranges, almonds, or citrons. Your name entered for life as owner in the Book of the Union. Can pay 10 down and the balance in yearly installments. Bleibtreustrasse 34, Berlin, West 15. The ad, of course, arrests Bloom's involuntary attention by drawing on his repressed Judaism with the notion of his name being written in a book, a clear reference to a crucial theme from Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur services, as well as the German name of the Berlin street Bleibtreu, which means stay faithful. It plays both on Bloom's guilt and his longing for an ideal or complete home, and by its geographical specificity, it marks in brief the ins and outs of the Jewish diaspora. For our purposes, it is especially important to recognize that the territory under discussion was Ottoman in 1904, but would become a British so-called protectorate by 1920, 2 years before the novel version of Ulysses was published. Its Ottomanness is emphasized by the land measurement rendered in dunams, signifying 1,000 square meters. So the melon fields, if they actually existed, would in fact be immense. What is equally important is to trace the trajectory of Bloom's responses to this image created by the ad from nothing doing, still an idea behind it, to a sense prodded by a cloud in the sky and his own pre-breakfast hunger to see the Holy Land as dead and cursed, as gray horror seared his flesh, to thinking about his own Dublin home, his soon-to-be-eaten breakfast, and his wife Molly. Smell the gentle smoke of tea, fume of the pan, sizzling butter. Be near her ample bed-warmed flesh. Yes, yes. This is frequently the trajectory of desires, appearance, rejection, and return in Ulysses. And in this archetypical scene, it is set off by advertising text associated with an overdetermined Ottoman mapping of a holy land which is at once sacred and profaned. Another example featuring a similar trajectory occurs in the Circe episode, in which, among Bloom's many costume changes, he appears in a red fez and Chadi's dress coat with broad green sash, and shortly afterward is greeted by a handsome woman in Turkish costume who stands before him. Opulent curves fill out her scarlet trousers and jacket, slashed with gold. A wide yellow cummerbund girdles her. A white yashmak, violet in the light, covers her face, leaving free only her dark eyes and raven hair. A chadi or qazi was an Ottoman magistrate or judge in a town or village, precisely the kind of figure who would mediate and keep peace between the empire's different ethnic and religious factions, or alert the military forces when required. A yashmak is a Turkish veil that observant Islamic women wore in public, covering most of the face except the eyes, like a Near East hybrid of a niqab and a burqa. The yashmak is, like the other garments, meant to signify the modesty of its wearer, as well as submission to her husband, which is quite a projection in the case of Molly. As is often the case in Ulysses, however, this vision is soon reversed, as the brothel madam Bella Cohen transforms into Bello, and, apparently to Bloom's delight, threatens the latter with violence. I shall sit on your Ottoman saddleback every morning after my thumping good breakfast of Matterson's fat ham rashers and a bottle of Guinness's porter, he belches. Very possibly I shall have you slaughtered and skewered in my stables and enjoy a slice of you with crisp crackling from the baking tin, basted and baked like sucking pig with rice and lemon or currant sauce. It will hurt you. Ottoman saddleback overlays the image of the victorious Turkish forces riding on horseback, perhaps those figures on whom the Qadi would call to quell a minor rebellion, with a far less exotic figure of the Western European domestic footrest of the same name, and sullies the image of the piously seductive woman in the yashmak with non-halal, non-kosher food and drink produced by Irish Protestant-owned companies. Yet it still preserves the rice and lemon or currant sauce associated in Bloom's consciousness in Lestrygonians and elsewhere with both cannibals and with the Near East and North Africa. As we saw yesterday, currants are also associated with Bloom's memory of his most intimate moment with a young Molly, though not in a culinary sense. My final example of Ottoman mapping and remapping or unmapping or rerouting directly concerns Molly, whom Bloom regularly associates with the exoticism of the Near East, in part because she was born in Gibraltar, which since 1704 had been dominated by the British Army as a way to control the western entry to the Mediterranean and to regulate the division between Africa and Europe. Gibraltar was never part of the Ottoman Empire, but the island shares with it, at least in Bloom's consciousness and indeed in Molly's own reflections, some of the associations with nearby North Africa and Near East Ottoman territories. Gibraltar itself draws its name from the Arabic Jabal Tariq, Mountain of Tariq, named after the Berber commander who helped conquer the Iberian Peninsula, much of which was dominated by Islamic rule for 7 centuries. Gibraltar's Islamic or Moorish history makes it importantly similar to many Ottoman territories. And before I turn to this textual example, I just want to note in passing that to my knowledge, very few participants in this wonderful conference have cited the Penelope episode in relation to mapping. It's worth recalling that the text ends not with the planet-like full stop concluding Ithaca, but like the Odyssey itself, with the marriage bed, which is itself a kind of map. Right? Shortly after she reveals in her interior monologue that her mother's name was Lunita Laredo, a Sephardic family name typical of Moroccan Jewish families who lived in Gibraltar and indeed throughout the Ottoman Empire, Molly, considering Poldy's marriage proposal that she herself had seemingly orchestrated, remembers the Gibraltar of her childhood. The Turk with the fez who used to sell red slippers, a displacement downward of the image in Circe of the Qadi in the red fez, but also the Greeks and the Jews and the Arabs and the devil knows who else, and those handsome Moors all in white and turbans like kings, asking you to sit down in their little bit of a shop. Here, Molly could equally be describing the Ottoman Empire's ethnically diverse cities, from Tripoli and Alexandria to Jerusalem and Baghdad to Salonika and Sofia and on up to Sarajevo. This Ottoman image is undoubtedly somewhat complicated by the fact that Molly is momentarily thinking not of the man Bloom proposing to her in Dublin, but of her first boyfriend, the Irishman Mulvey, a lieutenant in the British Army who kissed her under the Moorish wall in Gibraltar, and in turn this knowledge, along with a rather deflating near simultaneous thought of Bloom, well as well him as another, further undermines any wholeheartedly affirmative understanding of Molly's final yes, as if it were the orgasmic yes of the old Herbal Essences shampoo commercial, for those of you who remember that. Yet the novel's ending is nevertheless undeniably affirmative, and given the exotic momentum of Molly's monologue, leaves a strong residual impression of what, for Joyce, would have been the most significant aspect of the Ottoman Empire. Certainly not its mode of governance or its mercantile sensibility, but its array of ethnicities encountering each other in the same place at the same time, a place that is somehow more and less than a nation. The final yes of Ulysses is, in part, a qualified affirmation or reaffirmation not only of a marriage, but of an ethnic and linguistic diversity produced by the nightmare of history, but oriented toward life. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, for having me here. It's been wonderful so far. It's going to go downhill from here, I would say. No, joking. Sorry, Nico, lots more planet talk from me. But hopefully resonances from yesterday's talks as well. If Joyce's texts demonstrate a cartographical impulse, then they do so with a revisionist ethic, populating the inherited latitudes and longitudes of empire with a politics of the messiness of life. The colonial map is nothing but a visual stimulant to the panoptical gaze of empire. In its ordnance and cadastral versions, the map depicts the enervating extractive desire of the imperium, which will, by the 21st century, demolish the idea of the environmental commons and threaten the possibility of living. The body of scholarship that attends to Joyce's cartographical alertness is well established. We know, for example, that from its inception, the Joycean narrative is oriented through inherited maps. Whilst writing Dubliners, Joyce wished for a map of Dublin. His newspaper articles about Galway, as Jerry Kearns and Eric Bolson have especially noted, were based around the discussion of maps. Joyce sent a map to his son as he embarked on a singing career so that he could locate any places mentioned in any Irish songs. Although Joyce intended to write the moral history of my country, such a history, I would say, would be etched over topographical materialism by the time he wrote Ulysses. Here he revises the colonial map to represent, we might say, a cartography of the oppressed. But a further point of interest propels this book broadly focused on varieties of colonial anxiety. What Michael Seidel calls epic geography in Joyce's novel points not only to his correlation between topography and history, but also proclaims an equation between weather and character, a geographical determinism that extends to encompass a correspondence between climate and politics in Ulysses. Seidel notes that in Ulysses, Joyce works with a climactically displaced hero. If the Semitic Bloom has a difficult time of it in Ireland, a northwestern nation, he also has his difficulties with the Mediterranean sun culture, the climate in which the prototypical Odysseus sails. Bloom himself declares in Eumaeus, "I, for one, certainly believe climate accounts for character." Seidel masterfully analyzes the directional values assigned to each of the cardinal points in Ulysses. Such values stridently invoke the political rather than the geographical. Bloom, for example, is both Semitic and Irish. His climatological displacement is in active conversation with his political displacement. Such a trajectory from maps to topography, from climate to politics, especially resonates with the contemporary moment of compounding crises. These crises all converge on what we now increasingly identify not as climate change, but rather more correctly as climate collapse. The time to bemoan the death of nature is over. Rather, we are called to observe the ecology of Joyce's works in a manner befitting the moment of precarity. From today's perspective, the discursivity between climate and politics, or between climate and displacement, may appear precocious in Joyce's texts. After all, these were written well before CO2 emissions from the past threatened all futures. But such correspondences between what is traditionally understood as the world of nature and the world of culture should not be surprising, given that Joyce's intellectual formation occurs in the thick of empire. To inherit a legacy of colonization is to be acutely aware of empire's ecological fallout. To be aware, that is, of empire's transgressions of territory pales in comparison to its transgressions of ecological limits. To be colonized, as thinkers as diverse as Mahatma Gandhi and Frantz Fanon evidenced in their manifestos, was to be made aware of the fact that there is no politics of land, which also does not simultaneously engage a politics of earth. So what I'm proposing today is not so much a thesis, but rather a call for a renewed vigilance towards Joyce's conception of home, homeland, homeliness from the precipice of the contemporary moment we call the Anthropocene, the geological epoch of the human. From this vantage point, looking into an abyss of extinction, because remember that all geological epochs ultimately end with the end of its eponymous civilization, Joyce's equation of home transcends the conceptually limiting fiction of the nation-state. In such a scenario, it is the ecology of life, aimed as a politics for life, that is being mapped in the Joycean canon rather than a city or the world. The hemispheric pull of the Joycean address is perhaps articulated, as we saw yesterday, in a portrait of the artist as a young man, when Stephen Dedalus geolocates himself as Stephen Dedalus, Class of Elements, Clongowes Wood College, Sallins, County Kildare, Ireland, Europe, the world, the universe. Colleen Parsons has cogently argued that in Ulysses, the scale of enquiry into astronomical allusions suggests that these function not simply as a guide to reading practices, nor as a metaphor for structure or character relations, but also as a marker for the overlooked planetary ambitions of the novel and its gesture towards the larger geographical context in which it operates. Ulysses, he writes, pays attention to the traces of the planet always present, but often invisible and intangible, even in the most local, the most narrowly geographically defined places. To this, I will add, Joyce's planetary commentary in Ulysses complicates four interrelated but distinct categorizations of world, earth, globe, and planet. I can only offer a few short examples to demonstrate the complexity of this engagement. In the dream world of Circe, two of these concepts are in conversation. I do become your liege, man of life and limb, to earthly worship. Bloom holds up his right hand on which sparkles the Kohinoor Diamond, his palfrey neighs, immediate silence, wireless intercontinental and interplanetary transmitters are set for reception of message. Here, earthly refers to the corporeal attempts at communing with the metaphysical, whereas the word interplanetary suggests a universe-scoping scale that points both towards the origins of the stars and connects such origins to a geological and technological moment in the history of humans. Interestingly, it is the extractive regime of empire, symbolized here by a quintessential product of extraction, the Kohinoor Diamond, one of the largest diamonds in the world, that adorns the crown of the British Queen, that allows such interplanetary correspondence. Mined in the Kohinoor mine in India, the diamond represents the compaction of the sedimented layers of geological time. It is a befitting conduit to commune with the past, which is, of course, what interplanetary travel, or indeed space photography, allows. In Eumaeus, the word globe is specifically linked to empire's oceanic modes of transmission. Tired, seemingly, he ceased, his questioner perceiving that he was not likely to get a great deal of change out of such a wily old customer, fell to wool-gathering on the enormous dimensions of the water about the globe. Suffice it to say that, as a casual glance at the map revealed, it covered fully 3/4 of it, and he fully realized accordingly what it meant to rule the waves. The globe, as a spherical representation of a geoid Earth, not only misrepresents the geographical dimensions of the planet, but such a panoptic ordering disciplines the unruly nature of the planet and calls for an imperial ordering of it. The globe sits at the feet of Greco-Roman kings and queens. Its place is in the colonial schoolroom, from which originates an earth-encompassing globalization and ends in the neoliberalism of the contemporary moment. The globe of globalization, as Gayatri Spivak noted, sits in our computer screens, epitomizing the financialization of everyday life. No one can live there. In Scylla, we read that people do not know how dangerous love songs can be, the auric egg of Russell warned occultly. The movements which work revolutions in the world are born out of the dreams and visions in a peasant's heart on the hillside. For them, the earth is not an exploitable ground, but the living mother. The love song of globalization ends in the destruction of earth. We ride super fast into a future completely dependent on a fossilized past. It is digging of another kind, as that performed by the humble peasant, that engages the telluric materiality, the granular soil of earth. Here, the earth is not a zone of extraction, but seeding, suggestive of an ecology of life with which the human is in intrinsic communication. The latitudinal and longitudinal aspirations of empire, a cartography at least 500 years in the making, reveals its true malignancy in the contemporary moment of environmental collapse and the climate crisis. A renewed interest in Joyce's environmental ethic, or whatever we wish to call it, has to engage, I think, with these horizon-scoping alternatives to what has been sometimes, I would say simplistically, called eco-Joyce. There is no time to mourn nature. Like Joyce's character, the Anthropocene teaches us that coming events cast their shadows before. Andreas Malm notes that with global warming, we can never be in the heat of the present, but are trapped in the heat of an ongoing past, the result of countless acts of combustion stretching from the 19th century. To read Joyce from the anachronistic perspective of the Anthropocene is to encounter numerous coincidences between text and material life. Now that's a coincidence, we might say, but soon we proclaim, now that's a coincidence, second time. It is not surprising that Joyce's texts, especially open to a future response, are finding their proper place in a body of environmental scholarship. A number of these planetary motifs in Ulysses, I would say, are more elaborately and carefully theorized in Finnegan's Wake. So my call today is a call towards noticing the expansive horizon of Joyce's descriptions of Earth and earthliness. I'm proposing that the word horizon interpolates the charismatic concept of the Anthropocene. I view horizon here as a theory machine, a nodal point that collapses the disciplinary boundaries between historical, geological, geographical, and political thought. It animates, I would say, the interface between extractive capital, neoliberal statism, and the possibility of a biological life on Earth. A cursory glance at the lexical entry for the word reveals expectedly a common definition. The boundary line of that part of the Earth's surface visible from a given point of view, the line at which the Earth and sky appear to meet. Yet as many such etymological diggings unearth, horizon's applications and forms are diverse. Consider, for example, the adjectival caveats governing its visuality. Apparent horizon, natural horizon, sensible horizon, physical horizon, or visible horizon. Furthermore, horizon demarcates the conceptual circle within which critique is bounded, in the sense that the word charts the limits or reaches of an argument, one's thinking, etc. The Anthropocene is an intellectual stimulant, but it is nonetheless a politically enervating and corporeally devastating amalgam. Horizon, I would say, is its non-partisan interlocutor. Post-dating the publication of Ulysses, the very first pictures of the Earth's surface that were able to discern the curvature of the planet were taken from the Explorer 2 balloon, which ascended 13.7 miles in 1935. It made headlines across the world, and like Einstein's theories of relativity, which were proven by the 1922 solar eclipse expeditions, Joyce would have been influenced by this discovery as he wrote The Wake. The arc of Joyce's planetarity in Ulysses thus bends and bleeds into the space-time of The Wake. The Wake's gravitational energy highlights, I would say, a planetary predicament of home where the notion of place rather than space shifts between local and living topography and the dead of space. Joycean scholars, far greater than myself, have already shown how Einsteinian physics, Archimedean geometry, and Swedenborgian envisioning matter a great deal in The Wake. Together, these grant the book an elliptical energy, which coagulates in one reading as an existential question of planetary exile. Take, for example, the phrase Humpty Dumpty. It may be more than the fall of Tim Finnegan or Humpty Dumpty. In this section, Shem wants to painstakingly write down the story of his life. The narrative of his exile is not simply climatological, like Bloom, but also planetary. The form of exile is more radical than banishment from either a physical home or a political nation. The word dometry homophonically conflates the words dome, domus in Latin, home, which is given an elliptical shape, and geometry, the science of the earth, so that what is suggested is an exile from the earth itself. In such a reading, we might see that the author figure is actually being banished from the earthly plane by others of his own species, embothed upon by the very spit of himself, banished from the face of this earth, as it were, expelled truly. On the 15th of November 1926, after having read one of the early drafts of the Shawn sections of Finnegan's Wake, Ezra Pound supplied his judgment to James Joyce with the following words. Manuscript arrived this AM. All I can do is wish you every possible success. I will have another go at it, but up to the present, I can make nothing of it whatever. Nothing so far as I can make out, nothing short of divine vision or a new cure of the clap can possibly be worth all that circumambient peripherization. It's interesting for me to note that even Pound kind of notes this curvature of this book, circumambient peripherization. Such a reading deeply upsets the circularity of the ricorso that we complacently read in Joyce's use of Vico's The New Science. As Adam Barrows notes, Vico's cyclical vision of history, often referenced in Wake scholarship, is not that of a simple return or a recuperation of past origins. His ricorso is not automatically guaranteeing a next stage in an inevitably repetitive cyclical progression. The panarchical structure of the Wake, in fact, does not produce a simple process of repetition or even repetition with change. Indeed, a frame of the horizon suggests that Joyce's work toys with the idea of a post-human planetary future. It is true, the planet does not need saving. Human nature and the non-human nature on which humans rely do. I'm going to stop there. Thank you.
Thank you for so much to think about and enlarging our view of it all. We're going to take questions, and let me start. We'll have some from our virtual audience probably, but I'd like to start here. Yeah. And we have a mic coming.
Wow. Thank you for those three energizing talks. It was just such a great way to start the conference day. My question is for Malcolm. You were referring to the Anthropocene as anachronistic from the perspective of Joyce's novel. And it's just recently kind of come to my attention that the word Anthropocene was actually coined not in the early 21st century by Paul Crutzen, but in 1922. By a Russian geologist named Alexei Pavlov. And the word doesn't catch on, so it goes latent and then kind of resurfaces, but the concept is there, and it's sort of percolating through various scientific and philosophical communities in the 20s. So I wonder if part of what's entailed in your talk, Malcolm, is a kind of sense that Ulysses, if it's not using the word Anthropocene or quite the concept as it's come to be defined, is intuiting it in some way and is maybe theorizing the Anthropocene avant la lettre.
So yes, so something like, so the Joycean text actually, for me, functions not necessarily as a kind of a text which allows me to kind of theorize the Anthropocene, but rather as a way of looking at the Anthropocene edgeways. In a manner, Seamus Heaney said, a poem can't change the world, but it might allow you to see the world differently. And in many ways, I think those coincidences when reading Joyce allow me to think about the Anthropocene, or indeed the concept of the kind of crisis we are in newer and exciting and probably more productive ways.
Yes, right. Thanks, Steve.
There you go, Megan.
Thank you to all three of you for wonderful talks. My question is also for Malcolm. I was wondering how, as readers in the Anthropocene, we might instrumentalize this planetary consciousness that you so brilliantly draw out of Joyce. I'm thinking of contemporary discourse. I'm hearing about trying to move away from cognitively mapping climate collapse on a global scale, and people thinking that it might just be a futile or just a paralyzing task, and kind of moving more towards the hyper-local and looking at the geographies around us that we can control. And I still am figuring out where I come down on this question. So I was just wondering, and I hope this doesn't take us too far from Joyce, but whether you were thinking about that tension between scales, the planetary and the local, when you were reading Ulysses. Thank you.
Thanks very much for your question. I'm going to try and keep this short because I'm sure others have points to make. So one way to kind of think about it would be, if you're going to really engage with the Anthropocene, is to kind of refuse to enter into any form of capital. And I think the wake is an excellent example of a waste of time, right, in the sense of a very Marxist kind of a critique of how we might use time productively. It refuses to engage with the kind of replicability that capital kind of asks us to kind of perform. It actually kind of creates its own sense of community, right? And it refuses to engage in a conversation that is easily reproducible. And I think that in and of itself is an excellent kind of example that we might want to carry out in our daily lives, a refusal to enter into the market of capital.
Other questions? Yes, right down here. We'll get you a mic.
Quicker than you. Thank you. This is a question for Nico. I was wondering, because now that all the talk of planetarity and Penelope, you had mentioned of Penelope as a map, and now I can't help but think of Molly's bed as floating in space. And so I was thinking that, when I think of Penelope too, that there's that map of Gibraltar that Joyce needed or kind of relied on, and I was thinking, so you talk about the bed itself as a map, and is it a landmark, or is it the structure itself? So I was wondering if you might talk a bit about that kind of concept that you kind of alluded to or gestured to very quickly. I'm really curious to hear more.
As I recall, Molly traces a kind of history of the bed in the chapter, its movement, its origin. I think it was somehow related to Dante Reardon or someone they knew. I haven't reread the chapter lately, but I think that given its centrality to the ending of the Odyssey, Joyce is clearly drawing our attention to the sort of the tangibility, the materiality of the space, and marking it as part of a kind of domestic wandering that really doesn't move. So I'm sort of inclined to think of it. There is a way in which the novel does end with the full stop, and Molly is portrayed in the various schemas being sort of out of time or only time, off of calendrical or clock time. So I think there may be something there. It's clearly not a map in the way that other maps are maps. But I do think that it does mark space, and more particularly, it links with the kind of the personal historical journey that she's recalling, particularly at the end of the chapter. But thank you for the question.
Other questions? Yes, back there, Jim.
Thank you. It was a great panel, thank you. This is for you, Marilyn. I like the way your talk brought us back to Catherine's discussion of David Loebrun yesterday morning, where there were bits from other works of Joyce kind of floating along with everything else. And I was very impressed by your mapping of Lenehan's journey into Gallant's onto his movements in Ulysses. My question is, if you think about the internal differences of Ulysses, the differences in narration, the kind of heterotopia that Ulysses is, you get a mode of differentiation that would involve differentiations of cartography. When you go outside Ulysses to Dubliners, and you map from there, are you out of the spectrum of that differentiation, or can you imagine a larger spectrum of differentiation that would include Dubliners as well? It's a little abstract, but I hope you can see what I'm after. Is the kind of repertoire of differentiation within Ulysses? Something that, what happens to that when you extend it to the cartography of Two Gallants? That's the question.
Okay. Thank you for that question, Jim. So let me just be clear what you're asking. Are you in part asking about the kinds of differences, aesthetic differences or stylistic differences at all? Yes. Okay, so one of the things I will say about that, and I think that's come up quite a lot in our discussions, like how does Joyce's style figure in the things that we're saying? Anecdotally, I'll say this. When I teach the Joyce seminar, I always start with Dubliners. Because to me, the way into Ulysses is Dubliners. Because it begins to educate us about Joyce's style. And I think Two Gallants is an excellent example of it. I mean, I was worried in part about how much time I was spending on Dubliners when we are talking about Ulysses, right? But there could be much more to say stylistically about how the Dubliner stories work to anticipate what's happening. And when you read back from Ulysses to Dubliners and then map it forward again, all kinds of things are happening, right, that have been discussed here in the last few days in terms of temporal cartography, which happened in numbers of ways. I was only in some sense implying or gesturing toward because I was trying to get through a lot. And also just, recognizing the way that he's setting up certain kinds of wandering consciousness, not only, the relationship between walking and thinking that's going on, and that also has been talked about in the last couple of days. I mean, there's much more to say, but I don't think, that's why I had that whole riff on what happens when we map Dubliners onto Ulysses. And nobody talked, not nobody, I'm not going to go that far to say that I know for sure, but it's rarely done. Even though many people might agree with me here, and I saw some people nodding, that Dubliners, which is lovely, that Dubliners is a good way into Ulysses, and I truly believe that. I think much better than portrait, though you got to do portrait, right? But for the reasons that you asked, if that responds to your question. Thank you for it.
Yes, Kevin.
Yeah, there's I would say a question come comment for Malcolm, and this is from Kyle Macalino. Are you aware of the recently translated German expressionist early climate fiction novel, Mountains, Oceans, Giants by Alfred Doblin from 1924? The style in it is similar to Joyce. It's an interesting example of high modernism meeting sci-fi or cli-fi. So that for you.
Ooh, thank you very much for that. Kevin, maybe I can get that name off you, yet another book to read on this. This is great. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Yes, right down here. You need it. Thanks, Alice. It's hard to recognize everybody with the masks, so forgive me if I...
Hi, everybody, and this is to anyone. I'm really impressed by this sort of zoomed out sort of mapping of Joyce's view of the world, and at the same time it's sort of contrast with sort of the inner monologues, the solitary life of the soul of these characters. And I wonder if, in light of, post-structuralist thought in regards to like the closure of knowledge and end of truth, if beyond a description of this sort of situation we find ourselves in, trying to map out meaning in the world, if there is a prescription in this kind of difficulty of description that Joyce describes, if there is something beyond just putting together the dots, outside and inside, that you guys find in Ulysses or in Finnegan's Wake.
Let me just take a stab at throwing this back to the panel, just to make sure that I understand what you're asking, and it might be through Malcolm's statement about weather and character. I'm not sure, but I think you're also talking about what does it mean for our analysis of the characters or of the differences with the characters, or did I completely misunderstand what you were asking? I mean, I was compelled by that idea of weather and character. I thought of the moment when the cloud goes over the moment that so many of us have talked about, when the cloud hides the sun, and one can compare Stephen and Bloom, and we have, as to what the effects are. And thinking back to Atto's discussion of atmosphere and of anticipation and kind of affect. And is there any, how do you, maybe you could specify a little bit more about weather and climate in that kind of way, bringing it to the text. And you did, it's not that you didn't, but.
Well, I think, one of the things that I try and kind of read is kind of expanding Joyce's descriptions of weather into notions of climate.
Sure.
And I think the certainty of the prediction, coming events casting their shadow, resonates with our moment as readers of Ulysses now, because really the death of the phrase, the future will be better, that phrase has died a natural death, and it suggests because we actually know exactly what the future will be. The prediction has already happened. And I think, yes, moments of light emerging from darkness, and there are kind of resonances, I suppose, in the Orientalist dimensions of the book as well. What is lit up and what is hidden. Of course, the very hidden nature of the Orient calls for extraction and penetration, right? And it's so hard to kind of read those moments as moments of post-colonial Joyce, right? Yeah. Because all moments of Orientalism, after all, are rehearsals of the Oriental. So I think there are these kind of internal inconsistencies, but nonetheless, the overall picture of the prediction, I think, is there. And I actually don't think that this is in any way out of keeping with Joyce's post-colonial status, because I think being in a colony gives you a sense of the politics of the future in a way we don't really get in the imperial center. Yeah.
It is so striking to me how much, as we've mapped and spoken about geometry, diagrams, and space, that time is on everyone's mind. And I go back to where we started with Joyce saying to Budgeon, I want to give a picture so complete that if the city disappeared from the earth, it could be reconstructed. Out of my book, as always already, it's disappeared. The 1904 Dublin has disappeared by 1922. I mean, this has been said before, but 1916 is mapped onto 1904. So the palimpsest that we started with, again, the first night in the Ridge lecture, makes us think of what's already gone. I mean, that it's not, and how much the different layers of time and what's disappeared is haunting. Jim Chandler and I had a discussion about that yesterday, but how much is haunting?
I don't know how much time, speaking of which, I don't know how much time we have left, but can I pose a question to Malcolm?
Of course.
Yeah, I mean, it's not as though you haven't had enough of these, but I'm curious, actually linking the point that you made. Some of your quotations concerning world, Earth, globe, and planet were actually from, sort of A.E. Russell or, in the voice, the kind of droning, sleepy and wordy voice of Eumaeus. And it seems to me, I wonder the extent to which Joyce's view is not Russell's view. In some way, Joyce's parodying these views. And I wonder the extent to which the kind of comedic undoing allows us to sort of see this, or to take very seriously the horizon that you're positing, which I think is very serious and is revealed particularly in the wake. But I'm just wondering how you would encounter the stylistic undermining that is going on, or the kind of precision with which Joyce is making these positings.
Yeah, so that's a great question. Which ones do we take as the Joycean point of view? The authorial intention, so to speak, and that's impossible to answer. But what I can actually say is that if that is the case in the AE section, right, the AE code or the Russell code, that might actually indeed also be true in the Penelope code and Molly's descriptions of nature, right? Nature flowering and, the sunshine, the beautiful.
Yeah,
but that, of course, is not, but that also in many ways is undercutting its own description, because really that is not the only nature in Ulysses, right? It's also the kind of the viscosity of mud, right? It's also the kind of granularity of the sand on the beach. So overall, though, I am probably not trying to prove a theory of this is Joyce's point, because we kind of know already that he is inspired by things like Robert Ball and various other people who are talking in planetary terms anyway. So the question is not to kind of prove the authorial intention, but rather to kind of prove the variegated nature of that which we simplistically think of as the earth. To me, it is striking that the word world is very specifically used in cultural forms. The word globe is used in very specifically imperial forms. The word earth appears in a number of times in Ulysses. It appears in moments of agriculture. It also appears a number of times in Paddy Dignam's kind of funeral, right? So I think the point was made in relation to this thing we call the planet actually needs to be kind of more comprehensively engaged. And I think Joyce's use of those words might allow us to kind of think about things and shy away from dangerous slogans such as save the planet or stop climate change. We can do neither of those things. The first one doesn't matter. The second one we can't stop because we are already locked into a future.
And on those existential thoughts, we will take a break here and return to our virtual visitors in, I think, 15 minutes. Thanks. Thank you, panelists.